So we're reading from Isaiah chapter 3, and I'm reading verses 1 to 12. See now, the Lord Almighty is about to take from Jerusalem and Judah both supply and support, all supplies of food and all supplies of water, the hero and the warrior, the judge and the prophet, the soothsayer and the elder, the captain of 50 and man of rank, the counsellor, skilled craftsman, and clever enchanter. I will make boys their officials, mere children will govern them. People will oppress each other, man against man, neighbour against neighbour. The young will rise up against the old, the base against the honourable. A man will seize one of his brothers at his father's home and say, "You have a cloak, you be our leader. Take charge of this heap of ruins." But in that day he will cry out, "I have no remedy. I have no food or clothing in my house. Do not make me the leader of the people." Jerusalem staggers. Judah is falling. Their words and deeds are against the Lord, defying his glorious presence. The look on their faces testifies against them. They parade their sin like Sodom. They do not hide it. Woe to them! They have brought disaster upon themselves. Tell the righteous it will be well with them, for they will enjoy the fruit of their deeds. Woe to the wicked! Disaster is upon them. They will be paid back for what their hands have done. Youth suppress my people, women rule over them. O my people, your guides lead you astray. They turn you from the path.
Continuing from verse 13. The Lord takes his place in court. He rises to judge the people. The Lord enters into judgment against the elders and leaders of his people. It is you who have ruined my vineyard. The plunder from the poor is in your houses. What do you mean by crushing my people and grinding the faces of the poor? Declares the Lord Almighty. The Lord says, the women of Zion are haughty, walking along with outstretched necks, flirting with their eyes, strutting along with swaying hips, with ornaments jingling on their ankles. Therefore the Lord will bring sores on the heads of the women of Zion. The Lord will make their scalps bald. In that day the Lord will snatch away their finery, the bangles and headbands and crescent necklaces, the earrings and bracelets and veils, the headdresses and anklets and sashes, the perfume bottles and charms, the signet rings and nose rings, the fine robes and the capes and cloaks, the purses and mirrors, and the linen garments and tiaras and shawls. Instead of fragrance, there will be a stench. Instead of a sash, a rope. Instead of well-dressed hair, baldness. Instead of fine clothing, sackcloth. Instead of beauty, branding. Your men will fall by the sword, your warriors in battle. The gates of Zion will lament and mourn. Destitute, she will sit on the ground.
Isaiah chapter 4. In that day 7 women will take hold of one man and say, "We will eat our own food and provide our own clothes. Only let us be called by your name. Take away our disgrace." In that day the branch of the Lord will be beautiful and glorious, and the fruit of the land will be the pride and glory of the survivors in Israel. Those who are left in Zion, who remain in Jerusalem, will be called holy. All who are recorded among the living in Jerusalem. The Lord will wash away the filth of the women of Zion. He will cleanse the blood stains from Jerusalem by a spirit of judgment and spirit of fire. Then the Lord will create over all of Mount Zion and over those who assemble there a cloud of smoke by day and a glow of flaming fire by night. Over all the glory will be a canopy. It will be a shelter and made from the heat of the day, and a refuge and a guiding place from the storm and rain.
Okay, today I'm going to be talking to you from both chapter 3 and chapter 4 of the book of Isaiah. And in order to understand these chapters well, we first need to clarify a few terms that Isaiah uses. You'll see in the very first verse of chapter 3 and throughout that Isaiah says, "See now, the Lord Almighty." And the question is why Isaiah uses the word Lord so often. And the problem comes from the English language rather than from the words that Isaiah spoke. If you look very closely at that first verse, for example, you will see that the first use of Lord in most English translations begins with a capital L and then has lowercase letters. And that the second use of the word Lord is entirely in capitals. Why is that, Darren, you ask? I'm glad you asked, because I'm just about to explain. The first word, Lord, is the conventional word in Hebrew to translate Lord, for want of a better phrase. The second word, Lord, is different and is the crucial thing here. The reason that it has 4 capital letters is because it is a direct rendering of the Hebrew word that is YHWH in a paraphrase, which is normally spoken in Hebrew as Yahweh. Occasionally, English organizations, I shall not say which one, sometimes misrender that as Jehovah. But Jehovah is a bad use of it simply because, partially because it has one too many vowels in it than the English could have, and secondly because a certain organization insists that it is the only word that should ever be used as a name for God, whereas in the Old Testament and the New Testament there are many names for God. But so here Isaiah is saying the Lord, and then he's clarifying by saying the Lord who revealed himself to Abraham and Moses. Not just any God that the peoples believe in, not false or fake gods or idols that the people have made, but the God who brought the people out of Egypt, the God who established the nation of Israel under Abraham. That God who has been there with your people since the beginning He's the one who is about to hurt you. And that makes it doubly hard to take. The second thing that you need to notice here is that throughout this passage there is consistent use of the word Zion. And Zion in English has come to represent many things. There is a political idea of Zionism, which is the idea of re-establishing a holy land for the Jews in Israel by political means, which was very prominent in the 1920s and continues until this day. That is not what the Bible means. Politics is quite good. It is necessary. But it can never do God's work in the fullest sense. So Zion here is the gathered people of God. In the Old Testament, primarily from Israel, but in the period that this passage speaks of as the last days, from all nations. People like you and me. People made in the image of God who are equal in the sight of God. Now, the third idea here that needs some clarification is the idea, which is quite humorous, I guess, in light of today's national situation, where in verse 7, the person who has a cloak is encouraged to be the leader of the people. And that person says, I have no food or clothing in my house. Do not make me the leader of the people. And as a nation where we are sorely tested to find a leader of the people, we are led to question whether this passage has relevance to today. And the answer is, in one sense, yes. Every Bible passage must first be understood in its original context. So, first of all, here we hear Isaiah speaking to the Jewish people of his day. But then that context has to be applied to future situations that match with that situation, not in an arbitrary way, but where there is clear evidence of relevance. And as I've already said, this passage, from what we've heard in the earlier chapters, speaks of what will happen in the last days. And as I said a few weeks ago, the last days began when Jesus died and was raised from the dead, and continues until the time when he comes again on the clouds of heaven. And so this applies to desperate countries everywhere who are struggling to find good leadership and good moral direction. Because first of all, we will find that God brings judgment upon them. But secondly, we will find that God, when they have moved through that period of judgment, will bring blessing. And that's why it is so good in this that we continue not just to read chapter 3, but to read chapter 4 as well. Because chapter 3 speaks of a land that is directionless. Chapter 4 speaks of a great future for the people of God. It is interesting also to note that it says God will take away the judge and the prophet. And Isaiah is a prophet. What's he going to do in the future? Will he be attending the job centre? Because God's voice is going to become silent in the land. And that is what happened after the time of Malachi and until the time of John the Baptist. And so we see these things have been fulfilled. And so, looking at the negatives in this passage, we find that man will rise up against man and neighbor will rise up against neighbor. And this is the character of all nations who have abandoned God. And so when we see this in our own land, we should not be surprised. When knives are taken up and young men are stabbed, we should not be surprised. When members of staff in hospitals are abused, we should not be surprised. When teachers struggle to maintain order against children where there is no discipline in the home, we should not be surprised. And when churches flounder, we should not be surprised. And also, when we read that in the land where there is the nation of God, which is spoken of in chapter 3, the land of Jerusalem and Judah, that instead of fragrance, there will be a stench. We should not be surprised. This speaks partially of the idea of sacrifice as it was in the tabernacle and in the temple, and that when animals were sacrificed, a pleasing fragrance rose up to God. And we shouldn't misunderstand this, because God points out in other places that he takes no real pleasure in the sacrificing of bulls and sheep and things like this. But rather it is the humility and the brokenness of the person who is making the sacrifice that they represent that pleases God. And that is why ultimately the system of sacrifice ended when the one great sacrifice, who is Jesus Christ, came to bring peace for us with his Father. And today, as we look around the country, as we see Parliament in disarray, and frankly, as I look at other political parties and people saying, oh, we need a general election, my conviction is that there's no one out there that's going to sort out the problems. We see situations in the country where people cannot afford to make ends meet. And people no longer even think, has God abandoned us? Because they weren't thinking about God in the first place. But we ought to be feeling like that. Has God abandoned us? Because at least for Israel there was hope. For Israel, because they were meant to be a nation of God's people, they would be divided between those who were righteous, who would be rewarded, and those who were unrighteous, who would be punished. We are the people of God spread amongst the nations. And so, if judgment comes upon our nation, it falls on all of us collectively. And don't let your preachers fool you into thinking otherwise. When your preachers tell you that when God brings judgment and illness upon the land, the Christians will escape, my ankle testifies against them. It really hurts. I'm not just pretending. But there is a time ahead when all of this will be sorted. You know, in Yorkshire, where I grew up, they had a word. Probably still have this word. I don't know if you know this word at all. It is, I guess, a verb. And to give you the verb, it is to fettle. The idea is that if you have a coal fire, and the coal fire is starting to burn out, and there is no new coal to keep it burning hot, the only way and the best way is to fettle it in order to get rid of the dead coal, and then the coal that still has life in it will burn brightly. And if God brings judgment, that is what he is doing. He is fettling the fire in order that those who still have life will enable that God's Spirit will still burn in this land and in every land. It may mean that in the process you will lose your earrings and bracelets and veils and headdresses and anklets, the perfume bottles and the charms. I mean, this targets that at the ladies. I have to admit, I'm frightened, you know. My perfume bottles are going as well. It says aftershave on it, but I know what it is. It's perfume. You know, sometimes I go into a pub to get a drink and somebody will say, "Oh, I like your cologne." But when those things are gone, and when the spirit of judgment and spirit of fire has moved amongst a nation, then there will come a time when all of those from all the nations who are resident metaphorically on Mount Zion, the gathered people of God from the whole world, will be led by a cloud of smoke by day and a glow of flaming fire by night. And if you're smart, you think, I've heard that idea before. Oh yes, well, way back in the Old Testament, days before Isaiah, in the time of Moses. They came out from Egypt. You know, you may even have seen this at the cinema. That film, what's that called? The Prince of Egypt. Don't take it too literally. There's all kinds of things in that film that are actually not in the Bible. Somebody was talking to me about it the other week and telling me the big part that Ramesses played in the story of Moses. And I'm thinking, okay, that bit's not in the Bible, but, you know, maybe in Carry On Cleo or something, I don't know. But the bit that is in the Bible is that when the Israelites were faithful, they didn't get lost in the desert. They were led by God's Spirit, who came to them in a cloud of smoke and a flaming fire, day and night. And if only they'd followed faithfully, it wouldn't have taken them those 40 years to get to the promised land. They would have got there during Moses' lifetime. Now, our timetable is much more uncertain than even the timetable of the old Israelites. Because when we arrive at the promised land is dependent on when Jesus comes again. And there is nothing that we can do to influence that schedule. It is a mystery held in the hands of God the Father, who will send him forth. But it will happen, and it is promised. And so when you think, boy, things are a mess, always know that better times are ahead. It might not be next week, it might not be next month, it might not even be 2023. I can't believe that next year is 2023. I remember having a party at my house for the eve of the millennium. And as I look back now, I must have been about 8. Because I can't possibly be this old. And most of the people who were at that party are probably no longer alive. Because time has moved on. But Jesus is coming. And I don't know when. I don't wish I could tell you, because the Bible tells me that I'm not supposed to know. And so if I felt that I knew, I would stumble and think I'm deluded. But Jesus is coming. It says in this passage, over everything, the glory will be a canopy. The idea of something that protects. It will be a shelter and shade from the heat of the day, and a refuge and a hiding place from the storm and the rain. Pat was saying to me this morning just how wet you can get when it's raining heavily and you get out of the car and then you come to the church door. Imagine if she'd had a canopy over her to be a shelter from the storm. Wouldn't have that been good? And that is what is ahead of us. Because Jesus is coming, and we will be led in the ways of the Lord to follow him. Amen.